Kia koe. I'm really pumped, actually, for our next speaker, Michael McQueen, who is a trend forecaster. I'm not even sure what that is, and business strategist. His speech today is on how to thrive in an age of uncertainty, and boy, do we need to hear that. Michael is a multi-award winning speaker, change strategist, and best-selling author of 10 books. With clients including Google, Toyota, and MasterCard, he has helped some of the world's most successful brands navigate uncertainty and stay ahead of the curve. Michael is a regular commentator on TV and radio, and his work is featured in publications ranging from The Guardian to Forbes and CNN. In addition, Michael is a familiar face on the international conference circuit, having shared the stage with the likes of Bill Gates, Mel Robbins, and Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak. Having been formally named Australia's Keynote Speaker of the Year, Michael was inducted into the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. Can you please give a warm welcome to the stage, Michael McQueen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenny May, for that very generous introduction. Kia ora. Good to see you all. And what a treat to follow that series of speakers. Wasn't it? I just felt privileged to sit there and just experience that, particularly the last presentation there. There was just so much. In fact, a lot of those themes we're going to build on in the next few moments. So thank you so much to Anne and Dave and Raylene and all the team for the chance to spend a couple of minutes with you to hopefully pick up on some of the themes you talked about yesterday as well. A lot of change around technology, what that means for us, practically, what it means for you in terms of managing sporting codes and organisations, but even just society more broadly. So we're going to move relatively quickly this morning. Okay, I want to make sure we stick to time. We've got a lot to cover in a pretty short space of time. Before we start, though, I'd love to ask two quick questions this morning. First question, show of hands if you've ever endured a boring or irrelevant presentation at a conference before. Hands up if you've experienced that, just out of curiosity. Almost all of you. Okay, cool. Second question, be honest. Hands up if you were the one delivering that boring or irrelevant presentation at the time. A few of you are honest. Okay, my commitment to you is the next few minutes will be neither of those two things. Boring nor irrelevant. It's going to be a couple of things. Practical. It's going to be honest. Let's speak to what's actually going on right now, not just dance around themes, but it's going to be a bit of fun. I think fun is often underrated at most conferences and gatherings. So just to get our heads in the zone, to think about the future and how to thrive in an era where things are moving fast around us, let's have some fun. I want to play a quick game with you this morning. This is a game I'm going to call Bizarre Trends Trivia. Who loves a good trivia night? Any trivia buffs in the room? 6 of you, good. Okay, you'll be well placed in the next few moments. I'm going to ask you a question relating to something that has been in the technology news cycle over the last few months, and I wonder how many of you have been paying attention, all right? So here's the question I'd like to ask you this morning. What did Burger King recently use biometrics or facial recognition to figure out about their customers? Okay, so 4 options, multiple choice. Was it A, how hungry their customers were? B, how old they were? Was it C, how wealthy they were? Or was it D, how hungover their customers were? So let's do a bit of a vote here. Hands up, who thinks it was A, how hungry their customers were? Votes for A? Can I number of votes for A? Thank you, perfect. What about B, how old their customers were? Lots of votes for B, interesting, cool. What about C, how wealthy they were? That's a few for C. What about D, how hungover the customers were? Look at that, okay. Some of you are going to be stunned to learn this. And those of you wondering in, there's some tables at the front, don't stress. This is all going to be pretty relaxed this morning. It's hard, isn't it, when that's all that's left and you've got to wandering through the room, okay? Some of you will be stunned to learn this, okay? The correct answer on the screen here is actually D. Okay, so here's how this worked. You'd rock up to the counter or go into the app, upload a photo of yourself, and it would use AI to figure out just how dusty you were at that exact moment. And it would give you a discount on your meal based on how badly they thought you needed it at that exact moment. And I don't know how many of you would have actually fared quite well if this was done this morning for some of you after last night. But this whole theme of biometrics and facial recognition technology, we're seeing it infiltrating so many areas of the world right now. I mean, I flew back from the States from a thing there last week, and I was amazed. Boarding the flight, no passport, no boarding pass. I rocked up to the gate, looked at a camera, and then the gates open and onto the flight I went. Some of you have experienced that, and this is moving really fast. Now, closer to home, I mean, one thing we've seen in Australia over the last couple of years is the use of facial recognition technology at sporting venues to keep out blacklisted or banned spectators who just keep causing trouble when they turn up. It's hard to police this stuff, so it's a little bit Orwellian, okay? But this idea of actually trying to monitor and enforce things that otherwise are really difficult to enforce. Now, interestingly, we're also seeing not just humans that are sort of being subject to this, even the animals aren't safe from biometrics. So I was here in New Zealand, I'm down in Christchurch speaking at an agricultural conference a few months ago, and I was amazed to learn that right now here in New Zealand, we're seeing a whole pile of farms that are using facial recognition on their properties to monitor cattle as they roam around properties to see where their cattle are up to at any given moment. And I think examples like this, what it shows, and it's something we all intuitively know, and certainly yesterday this was a recurring theme from every conversation that I've had with anyone who was in the room, and this idea that the world is moving fast. This stuff is changing truly more quickly than most of us would like. There is that sense of being overwhelmed with just the pace of change, particularly from a technology standpoint. And so as a room full of leaders, what I want to spend some time this morning looking at is this question of how do we gear up for what's coming, bearing in mind just how quickly stuff is changing. And if we're going to do that well, I want to put it to you, there are 3 paradigms or priorities that are going to matter most as we think about the next few years. If you have something to write some notes with, you may want to grab it out because we're going to move relatively quickly here. And as we go through these 3 sort of paradigms or priorities, I wonder which for you is going to be most relevant as you think about charting a course for the years ahead. And the first key is simply going to be this. Right now, we need to be thinking tides and not waves. Now, just to unpack this, I often use this as a metaphor to describe the type of trends we've got to be really focusing on as opposed to the fads that come and go. And if you've been around the sector for more than, 6 minutes, you might have noticed a few fads over the years. You know those things you've heard about, perhaps at conferences like this that you're told are going to be like the next big thing. And then 18 months later, you're like, whatever happened with that? Nothing ever happened. Nothing ever eventuated there. And that's not a trend, it's a fad. And fads are like waves at the beach. By their nature, a wave is loud and exciting, but a wave crashes ashore and then it retreats. It doesn't leave a permanent mark. And so we've got to be so careful, particularly as leaders of organisations with limited budgets and the need to retain social capital. If every time you go to your teams, because I know some of you are running relatively small, lean teams, every time you go to them, like, the next big thing, here's what we've got to jump onto. In fact, some of your teams are terrified of you coming back from this conference, like, oh yes, what did you hear about at the conference this year? There's like, what's the new thing we've got to do? And we can't keep jumping at everything that comes along, every wave, because we burn through our budgets and we erode the social cred we have with our teams and our members. So we can't jump at shadows, every wave that comes along, but in contrast, you think about a tide. A tide by its nature is silent. It is slower moving. It's actually easy to miss the changing of the tides, not even notice that it's happening if you don't know where to look. But over time, a changing tide will reshape the entire coastline. And so what are those changing tides that we've got to be really zeroing in on as we think about the years ahead? And we could spend a couple of hours this morning looking at this question of what are some of those mega trends or macro trends that are coming. I know you picked up on a number of those themes yesterday. But in the time we've got together, I want to look at just two tides that will shape the next few years for all of us in different ways. And I wonder from your perspective, which of these is going to be biggest for you? I have a hunch as to what you'll probably say. Okay, the first tide I want to look at is around this whole theme of AI and machine learning. And you heard yesterday in Francis' session a lot of discussion about AI. I want to pick up on some of those themes because the reality is this technology is moving ahead really fast. Now, interestingly, even though we've heard a lot about AI, and let's just be candid, a lot of what you're hearing day after day in the press right now is hype about AI. Okay, and there's actually a little bit of like the bubble deflating already, but even though there's a lot of hype, there is some substance with this stuff that is truly revolutionary. It's going to change the game literally for all of us in the next few years. In fact, we'll talk about some things that have changed even in the last 2 weeks from an AI perspective that we can't afford to ignore. But I've been looking at this for goodness, probably 6, 7, 8 years pretty closely now in terms of the impact AI is having on industries, particularly like pick an industry like the automotive industry. Like I work with the car makers, they're my clients. I only tell you for them, one of the big disruptions they've been gearing up for a number of years now is what happens when AI begins to drive our cars instead of us. Now, how many of you find the whole notion of a fully autonomous car moderately terrifying? Hands up if you do. Driverless cars, who gets nervous with the idea of a driverless car? Okay, lots of you do. Here's the interesting thing, this technology is closer to becoming a reality than most of us realise. So I first got the chance to see some of this stuff in action in late 2019. So I spent a chunk of time in Silicon Valley watching some trials being done by Waymo, which is Google's driverless car spin-off company, and I was stunned. how clever the technology was, how intuitive it was. But even in late 2019, you talk to the peeps at Google, and they're like, doesn't matter how good the technology is, this is not going to be on public roads anytime soon. In fact, their estimate at that point was late 2027, maybe 2028. Why? Because lawmakers are nervous. Like, we're talking sphincter tightening nervousness, okay, about letting driverless cars on the road with human drivers, because it gets messy really fast. Now, what's interesting is that nervousness changed rapidly in the pandemic years. We saw numerous cities, in fact, numerous states in the US, rush through changes in legislation allowing for these things. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a few cities start rolling these out in a big way. And now, it was interesting, I was in Phoenix a little while back, had the chance to ride in a fully driverless car for the first time, and it was an incredible experience. In fact, I want to show you a video of this experience. As I show you this video, I want you to pop yourself in the vehicle with me. Imagine what it feels like viscerally to be in a car that no one's actually steering the steering wheel of. Some of you already look nervous before I even show you the video. Okay, but let's have a quick look up here on the screen. Check it out. Well, it's a beautiful morning in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm about to go in my first ride in a Waymo One fully autonomous driverless car. And here it is. What to do is click start ride. At first it seems sort of kind of unusual to see a vehicle that no one is actually driving. And there's not a lot of traffic this morning yet, but even still, the degree of complexity to figure out these intersections and traffic and pedestrians and garbage trucks that are doing the rounds. Hey, so this is interesting. Going around this corner here, there's a fair bit going on. We've got a car crossing over, we've got traffic coming the other direction. But interestingly, as we turn the corner, there's actually some construction and a pedestrian who's just crossed up here, but some construction work, a roadwork sign. I'm gonna be fascinated to see how it navigates all of this. Wow, here we go. It's figured out that person is there, a road worker, the truck itself and the trailer. It's waited till it's clear, and then off we go. It's pretty impressive. So this technology is wild. I mean, who'd be up for it? Who'd get into one of these cars right now if I pulled up out front? He's like, yeah, I'd give it a go. Look how bold some of you are. I love this. Okay, so you might be like, yeah, I'd get into a vehicle that no one's behind the steering wheel of. What about this? Would you get into a vehicle that doesn't even have a steering wheel? Because that's where we're heading next, okay? Vehicles with no steering wheels and no brake pedals, just for good measure, okay? And interestingly, as I work with the automakers, one of their big questions right now is this question of what are we going to spend our time in our vehicles doing when we don't have to concentrate on driving them anymore? In fact, this question was asked of a bunch of consumers a little while back. 5 things came at the top of the list when people were asked this question. I want to give you 30 seconds, person next to you. If you had to guess one of the top 5 things people said when asked this question, what would your best guess be? 30 seconds, person next to you. Go for it. All right, 10 seconds to go, 10 seconds. 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, who's brave enough to share? What do you reckon, what came up in your conversations there? What do you think was on the top 5 list? Who's willing to kick us off? Always takes one brave person. What did you say? Yeah. Sleep. Having a sleep was one of the top 5. But, well, can you imagine the level of trust required to drift off to sleep as you're hurtling down the freeway? But that was one of the top 5. Thank you. Any other guesses what was on this list? What did you say? So social media, so yeah, that was related to one of the top 5. Good job, thank you. Any other themes at the back? Yes. So doing emails, so catch up on work, that was also one of the top 5. Well done. Any other guesses? You've guessed a few of them already. Any other guesses? What did you say? Yeah. Yeah, connecting with family or friends, like just doing life in a way that doesn't require concentration on the road. That was related to, again, one of the top 5. So you've guessed a lot of them. Here was the top 5 list, okay? So number 1 on the list was being entertained, so watching TV and movies. Social media was somewhat related to this. Number 2 was doing work, so catch up on email. Number 3 was what we heard at the front, having a sleep. Number 4 was eating and drinking. Didn't say what you were drinking. But the whole notion of designated driver disappears, doesn't it, once you haven't got to drive a car anymore. Now, the last one surprised me. It surprises me how often this one comes up in conversations with audiences too. In fact, I was speaking with a group of school principals recently. One of the dirty buggers, the first thing he said when I asked this question when they were discussing in groups was number 5. He used different language. But what the researchers came back with was this word here, romance, which would make the morning commute more interesting and awkward, right? If you pull up next to a car, that's all going down. Okay, who here said something in that hemisphere here this morning? There's only a few. Look at that. There's always a few in every crowd. So this is just, look, the impact of AI in one industry like the automotive industry. And so you're seeing sector-wide changes already coming through as a result of this sort of technology. What we're also seeing, though, is AI changing the game at an interpersonal level. And I should tell you right up front, this next example, this next tool, I still haven't decided whether I think this is really cool or just downright creepy. I reckon the jury is still out for me. I can see arguments both ways. But if you haven't heard of this one, you may want to check it out. It's a thing called Crystal Nose. Now, has anyone heard of Crystal Nose before? Hands up if you have. Okay, a couple of you have. So Crystal Nose, I first came across about 6 or 7 years ago in the HR and recruitment world because I saw organisations using this as a pre-screening tool for new hires coming onto their team. So you could get a sense of, would this person be a good fit for the team or not? So it's basically a sentiment analysis, personality profiling tool using AI. Now I've seen some of my clients using this in a whole lot of other ways in the last few years, particularly in remote and hybrid work, where you might have to jump on a high-stakes conversation call with someone and you don't quite know how to pitch it because you've not met them before. You've not got that gut feel for them. So you can do some research using Crystal Nose. Or let's say you've got someone on your teams who there's a bit of a block with, you can't quite get through to them. You're not quite sure what it is, okay? Pop their name into Crystal Nose, and what happens, this system, the AI in the back end, will scour the web in a few nanoseconds and look at everything that individual has liked, shared, or followed online. Oh yes, okay, and come back to you with a bit of a cheat sheet of the best way to connect with that person, to motivate them, to lead them, or to persuade them. Now again, is this cool? Is it creepy? I can see arguments both ways here. Who's in the this is pretty cool camp? Who thinks Crystal Nose is pretty cool? 4 of you, good. How many of you think it's just downright creepy? Who's in that category? All right, a few more. And you know what this does raise, by the way, is the question around ethics. Just because we can use these tools, should we? And we're going to have to grapple with these questions over the next couple of years. Now, in terms of creepy uses of AI, I think something we can probably all agree is just downright creepy is what we're seeing happen right now in the area of deep fakes. Now, if you haven't heard of this, a deep fake is an AI-generated replica of a human, so it might be a sound file that sounds like a real person, a photo that's artificially generated, or a video, like video footage, for instance. And we're already seeing deep fakes causing a whole lot of issues, particularly in the political arena. In fact, we saw a few months ago now, leading up to the New Hampshire primaries, a deep fake of Joe Biden ring thousands of voters and ask them to stay home and not vote. The opposite of what real Joe Biden would have wanted them to do. But there were a whole lot of people who didn't turn up to vote that day because they thought they got a call from, a recorded call from the president asking them not to vote. Okay, and this is we're going to see in the next few months, this is becoming increasingly a challenging thing in schools. By the way, one of the big things we're seeing right now is the ease of creating deep fake porn of classmates. In Australia, we've had multiple schools in the last few months where students have been expelled from the school because they're doing this stuff. And if you haven't heard about this, you'll hear more about this over the next few months. It is happening increasingly in our schools. And there was a thing actually in the New York Times a little while back giving people a chance to test how good they were at figuring out whether a series of images were real images of real people or AI-generated deep fakes. And I'm going to replicate this online quiz here this morning. We're going to have a quick game of deep fake heads and tails. Okay, so if you could just stand up where you are, please just stand up at your spot there. I'm going to show you a series of photos. If you think this is a real photo of a real person, pop your hands on your head. If you think it's an AI-generated deep fake, hands on your tails or your backside, okay? And if you get out, like when you're a kid, you have to sit down. Now, let's do a practice round first, okay? So you don't get out if you get this first one incorrect. So here's the first image. Is this, hands on your head, a real person, or is it an AI-generated deep fake, hands on your tails? Okay, heads, everything is real, tails, everything is fake. All right, correct answer is this is actually a fake image. Okay, so stay standing. That was just a practice round. It's tricky, isn't it, right? Okay, here's the first legitimate test image, okay, up on the screen. Is this a real person, hands on your head, or an AI-generated deepfake, hands on your tails? I'll give you a few moments to do this. All right, the correct answer is this is actually a real image. So hands on your if you had your hands on your backside, grab a seat. Okay, next image, let's check out this one here. Hands on your head, everything it's real. Tails, everything it's an AI-generated deep fake. All right, give you a few more moments. Okay, this is actually a fake image. So if you had your hands on your head, grab a seat. All right, the last photo. Here we go, up on the screen. Is this an AI-generated deep fake, hands on your tails, or a real person, hands on your head? What do you reckon it is? Okay, the correct answer is actually a real person. Okay, so if your hands on your head, stay standing. Okay, look around the room. There's not many people still standing. Those of you standing, thank you. Grab a seat. Okay, this highlights, by the way, just how tricky it is to figure this stuff out. Okay, and again, we're going to see this play out in some really interesting ways for many of us over the next couple of months. And you'll see this probably already starting to bubble away in some of the teams you're working with. Now, where this all fits into is a much bigger conversation around what's typically referred to as generative AI. So generative AI, the most famous form of it is ChatGPT, but there are so many others that you're going to see come online in the next little while. What we've seen in the last few weeks in terms of Google's announcements with Google Gemini, which is their equivalent to ChatGPT, is really significant. The big one to watch, by the way, in fact, I would encourage you, if you're thinking about how do we start to use AI in day-to-day life, you need to probably look closely at a thing called Microsoft Copilot. Because what Copilot's interesting about, and I was working with a Microsoft crew the other week, they were telling me that what's cool about it is they've actually extended a thing called the Copilot Copyright Protection Guarantee. I did not know about this, but it's a game changer. What this means is if you or your teams create something, maybe it's new content or even images, synthetically generated images in Copilot, if anyone ever challenges you and says that's plagiarized or copied our stuff, they will actually go into bat for you and say, no, you own the copyright if you produced it within Copilot. And so this is the one I think, while ChatGPT is great for individuals to use, Copilot from an organizational perspective is going to be a far safer bet. Now, as we think about AI, and I know you heard a lot about this yesterday, the reality is you are being bombarded now as leaders with, buy this, get this subscription. There's so many options out there. And what I'm seeing a lot of my clients doing is actually wasting a lot of money right now, just with tests, experiments to see what they should use. And can I encourage you, when you're thinking about AI deployments in your teams, your organizations, the best way I encourage you to think about this is AI is going to be one of two things. It'll either be a painkiller, in other words, it deals with the headaches in the organization, things that are slowing you down bureaucratically, or it'll be a multivitamin. It gives you superpowers you didn't have before. Okay, and there's some great research just in the last few weeks that's emerged around what does this look like practically. In fact, a piece of research released by the crew at McKinsey has looked at, for organizations, in many cases the size of a lot of the organizations you're leading, how does this look practically? So some great benchmarking stuff in here about, what's the business case for using AI? And because McKinsey's website is a dog's breakfast, there's a lot on there. I'm going to give you a QR code for this report. I'd encourage you to scan this, download the report, and digest it with your teams, because this is where we go from all the bright flashy object stuff around what AI can do to looking at the business case. Who's using this and how are they using it? And if we look at this notion of painkiller versus multivitamin, what I liked is one of the graphs in this research sort of highlighted this very question. What's the painkiller versus the multivitamin? Where have we seen the greatest opportunity when it comes to using generative AI? And so this little graph here, I thought, told a pretty powerful story. So over on the right-hand side in the light colours, this is like the multivitamin side. The darker blue is sort of the painkiller. What are the pain points, the points of bureaucracy? So you'll see typically the greatest gains can be made when it comes to marketing and sales functions and also HR. But this will give you a sense of what are some of the things you're doing in organisations where the greatest opportunity lies to start using these AI tools well. Now, if we look specifically at sport and sporting codes, there's been a lot happen over the last few years when it comes to AI, particularly the use of AI in how games and codes are run. A couple of examples that have been sort of capturing my attention. One I was talking about recently on one of the breakfast TV shows back home was what we've seen from a company called Prevent Biometrics. Based over in Cleveland in the US, they initially developed smart mouth guards for military purposes, where particularly for parachuters, they could actually get a sense of how big a hit to the head had been, so they could measure them and in real time figure out whether that paratrooper needed to have some time out just to recover or whether they're actually okay. We've now seen a number of these same technologies being deployed in sporting codes. And Raylene, I don't know if you saw this in terms of World Rugby. Okay, so I believe all the elite games now, is it actually across the board, each of them are using these smart mouth guards? Or is it on the way? You may have seen. They're testing still. So AFL and NRL teams are also testing this right now in Australia. But the beauty of this is this starts to cover you legally, because the question, of course, is someone has a big tackle, was it just a bad tackle, or do they actually have to have time out? Because if they go back into play, there's actually a danger or a risk. So in real time, this will measure the severity, the direction of the hit, and what probably needs to be done. So smart mouth guards are something we're going to see from a safety perspective come into play literally in the next little while. I love this example here that was tested at the most recent World Cup. This is a soccer or a football, depending on what you want to call it, developed by Adidas. It's actually got sensors built into the soccer ball or the football that'll give you specific GPS location of where the ball is at any given moment. So part of this is about making the job for refs a little bit easier to try and make it clearer as to exactly where a ball was at any given moment. But what they're also doing, this is allowing greater visualizations and deeper analysis of sport to be able to create all those visual overlays for people watching from home to make it a much more engaging and rich experience. But it's not just for people at home. We also saw at the World Cup the use of augmented reality. So for those who were sitting in stadiums watching the game live, they could actually hold their phone up to the game and get overlaid over their screen many of those graphics and statistics that otherwise get them when they're watching from home, to make it feel a lot more engaging and interesting for viewers. And the truth is, you look at some of these and you think, well, is this technology good? Is it just encouraging people to be more passive and be the spectators when it comes to sport rather than getting people involved in sporting? And I love this next example here that I came across a few months ago. So Saucony have actually developed a thing called, and what a great name, the Marathon Challenge. So how's this for a stat? Your thumbs scroll an average of 78 miles per year. That's 3 marathons is the distance your thumbs scroll on your phones. Some of you have got really strong thumbs, okay, whether you realise it or not. So what they've done is they've actually developed an app with some very clever AI that syncs with your phone, and it measures your walking paces. And in any given month, if you walk further than you happen to scroll in that month, it's like the whole gamified thing. It unlocks a whole lot of discounts on Saucony merchandise and equipment. And again, it's trying to, how do we give people ways of measuring whether they are active enough or not? So we're seeing a lot of this start to come into play. And the truth is, every industry I'm working with is grappling with this. How do we use AI well? In fact, I love this last little example here. This made me laugh. Apparently, the fortune cookie industry, even they are trying to figure this out. So I didn't realize this. There's only 5 companies in the world that make fortune cookies, that write the actual fortunes in a fortune cookie. Of the 5, half of them are now using ChatGPT to write those fortunes. So not super authentic, but very efficient. The challenge is it's a bit hit and miss in terms of what they're actually producing. Exhibit A up on the screen of just how hit and miss some of this stuff is. Okay, and Jenny made it's a bit like this example we talked about before about getting ChatGPT to write intros, how tricky that can be, because sometimes it gets things wrong. So that's the first tidal trend, is around AI. The second tidal trend has more to do with the people side of what we're seeing in our sporting codes. And that's what's happening right now from a generational change standpoint. And particularly the influence of a generation coming through who were the group just younger than the millennials, or Gen Y, that group called Generation Z. So Gen Z, in case you're not aware of this, are getting all grown up. So the oldest Gen Zs are now actually like 24, 25 years of age. So their birth years were in the late 90s through to the early 2010s. So I should just check, how many of you are Gen Z here this morning? Any Gen Zs in the room? All right, we've got 1. Well, okay. I'm going to talk 1 and a little bit of dishonesty on table, whatever here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about you as if you're not here. I hope that's okay. How many of you got Gen Zs in your families? Hands up if you do. All right, lots more hands. So if we look at this group, there's some great stuff they are bringing with them into the workplace particularly, and into society more broadly. A couple of things we are seeing with this generation that really give some shape as to why this is a tide you can't afford to ignore. Okay, the first thing we're seeing with Gen Z is they're incredibly purpose-focused. Okay, and it's interesting, we often talk about this theme of their approach to things like equity and sustainability, and how much these are core values, and they truly are. In fact, to give you a sense of what this looks like practically or economically, we saw an example recently of a company many of you would know named Etsy. Etsy shelled out $1.6 billion to buy an app that I'm guessing some of you have never heard of, called Depop. Who's never heard of Depop before this moment in their lives? Hands up. Okay, lots of you haven't. So ask a teenager, they'll tell you. Depop is an app they use to buy and sell used fashion and accessories. What they often refer to as re-commerce, the idea of the circular economy, using stuff over and over again. Now, firstly, think about the impact of this from a merchandising standpoint. Retailers are grappling with this big time, because the data we saw last year showed that 2 out of 5 items in a Gen Z's wardrobe were owned by somebody else before that Gen Z purchased them. So a far more sustainable approach to consumption. And picking up on something that Jacob shared before around the impact of this, with golfing, and how does this impact membership and engaging with the community. Working with Golfing Management Australia last year and the year before, working with a lot of the people who are leading the golf courses in Australia, this sustainability thing is front of mind. Gen Zs who are pushing back, saying to the golf courses, What are your sustainability initiatives? And not just in terms of membership or players, but even staff coming onto their teams. Trying to attract staff is proving a bit of a challenge for the courses who are not taking this stuff seriously. Now, this is actually a broader trend. In fact, here's some global benchmarking data from the crew at Randstad that showed how many Gen Zs will not accept a job or a role with an organisation if there's not a values alignment. Now, for older generations, they're like, it'd be nice if we had values alignment, particularly around sustainability. For Gen Z, it's a non-negotiable. And so as we look to try and attract talented young people to the industry, this has got to be a part of the discussion, is what are we actually doing meaningfully to address some of this stuff? And okay, second thing we're seeing with Gen Z, the first one is their purpose focus. Number two, they tend to be just a little bit praise-driven, okay? In fact, interestingly, there's some research released by the Pew Research Centre early last year which found that 40% of Gen Zs would like to receive praise from their boss at least 3 times a week, if that's cool. And some of you are like, are you serious? Like 3 times a week? I mean, for some of you, like once a year at the Christmas party is heaps. Like just do your job, okay? But there's this focus on needing a lot more praise and validation. Okay, and it's interesting too, we're also seeing this when it comes to managing or leading Gen Zs, extending to the language you are using. In fact, I don't know how many of you have seen a book in the last little while that's come up called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. Cracker of a book. I was finishing reading it yesterday on the flight across. There was so much in there around what has driven this as a trend in the younger generation. And what's interesting is even the language you use, particularly with your Gen Z team members, actually matters. In fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I had to suppress an eye roll when I saw this article in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago, because it talked about if you're leading Gen Z in your teams, you've got to be aware of the term they use was anxiety-inducing language. For instance, you can't call it a performance review now because that's too anxiety-inducing. You've got to call it a connect session because that's just a bit nicer. Okay, and even they said, and I've noticed this already starting in corporate land, okay, even the word feedback is seen as too harsh, so now feed forward is seen as the more sort of approachable, encouraging use of language. And again, I mean, where has so much of this started? And you've seen this in your codes and your tournaments over the last few years, the expectation amongst kids, and you've seen this start in schools, of every runner in the race gets a ribbon. Not wanting to make anyone feel like they've not made the grade. And I get that the intent behind that. The challenge is, in our efforts to try and build resilience in young people by removing what's often referred to as dysphoria, which is disappointment, frustration, not winning, we've actually done the very opposite. We've actually created a lack of resilience, and we could look into the psychology of why this is. The big thing that underpins this is that we've had an assumption that you can give someone else self-esteem. You can't. You cannot give another human being self-esteem. You can give encouragement, you can foster confidence. Genuine self-esteem typically is only achieved through mastery. Trying, failing, recovering, feeling a sense of agency as a result of that. And so what we've seen is this massive trend, and you see how this plays out practically over the last few years. A little while back, in fact, I think it was 2 months ago now, Scrabble released a new version of the game based on feedback from Gen Z. So the one side of the board's the normal sort of old school game of Scrabble. If you flip it over, there's a version of Scrabble where no one wins. It's just, it's just for the love of the game, okay? And it speaks to this desire for a generation to avoid anything that smacks of what's often referred to as dysphoria. Again, those sort of darker emotions like disappointment and frustration. If we have time, we'll come back to that at the end. All right, third thing we're seeing with Gen Z is they can sometimes be just a little bit phone obsessed, okay? Some of you may have noticed this if you're parents. So here's the headline stat. Gen Z, on average, are using their phones for 6 hours per day. I actually thought that was on the low side. I thought it would be higher than that. So 6 hours a day. And in a few moments, we'll look at this question of what are they spending their time on their phones doing. But the equally important question is, what are they not spending their time on their phones doing? Do you know what they're not spending their time on their phones doing? Answering them. Okay? And so some of you have got Gen Z kids, you know this. Okay, you call your kids and they won't pick up. They'll text you back and say, what'd you call for? It's like, well, if you answered, you'd know, right? But there's a genuine fear of picking up the phone and talking to another person. Like, super happy to text, happy with Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat Messenger. But if you have to talk to someone, it's a confronting thing. Now, this extends to a whole lot of the ways they're using their phones. In fact, I've got a Gen Z on my team. I rang her recently. She didn't pick up, of course. Went to her voicemail. But instead of being a message like, hi, it's Amy, leave a message, it was like, you have called 0402, like the official sort of telco message. When I finally spoke to her, I said, what's the deal? How come you haven't got a welcome message on your phone? And she said, none of my friends ever use voicemail, ever. She said, the only people who ever leave me voice messages are you and my granddad. I'm like, awesome. I feel very old all of a sudden, right? But truly, so if you've got Gen Zs on your team, do not leave them a voice message. It's every chance they will not get it. They will not check it. In fact, one of the things we're seeing with Gen Z, the new etiquette is if you've got to call them, text them first to say, I'm going to call you in a few minutes. Is that cool? This is just so much of the way that they are operating, particularly when it comes to using their phones. Now, if we look at this question of what are they spending their time on their phones doing, obviously social media is a big part of the equation. It's not Facebook, by the way. Facebook's where their grandparents hang out. Where they are spending time, Instagram, Snapchat, but the big one's TikTok. It's hard to overstate how big a deal TikTok is for Gen Z. So the average use time for Gen Z on TikTok is 2 hours per day. This is massive, and it is fundamentally changing the way they're engaging with organisations and brands. So if you're trying to connect with Gen Z to attract them to enrol, to become players, to become members, or parents, in fact, because increasingly we're dealing with Gen Z parents, the question's going to be, what role is TikTok going to play in that mix? Now, a good example of how different this whole game with TikTok would be this brand here. Now, many of you wouldn't know Martinelli's. They're an iconic apple juice brand based in the States. Been around for 170-something years, but they went viral a little while back on TikTok with Gen Z for a reason that might surprise you. They went viral because a whole lot of Gen Zs discovered if you bite into a package of Martinelli's juice, it sounds like you're biting into an apple, like a real apple. And so you might think, well, and why does that even matter? Which is a great question, okay? But an irrelevant question when it comes to TikTok, right? So I'm going to show you what went viral on TikTok with Martinelli's and then show you the impact this had on them as a brand, okay? This is significant. Watch this.
Okay guys, so we have these apple juice that when you bite the plastic, it's supposed to sound like you're eating an apple, so I'm gonna try it. Did that kind of sound like it? Whoa! Wait, come, ready? Oh! Okay.
Now, I don't know how many of you look at that video and think, and that is everything that is wrong with one generation in one short video, okay, and I get it. And yet, look at the impact this had on Martinelli's as a brand in terms of their online engagement. Like, it fundamentally changed how relevant this brand was in the eyes of Gen Z. And there have been some other examples like this, even in the last 12 months. So McDonald's have had a thing called one of the thick shakes last year went viral on TikTok. We've seen a couple of the cranberry juice brands, Ocean Spray in particular, have gone viral on TikTok. It's fundamentally changed how relevant they are in the eyes of Gen Z. And what's interesting about TikTok as well is that it's also changed the language Gen Z are using. So up on the screen are some common terms that you might hear Gen Zs using. And if you've got Gen Zs at home, you're going to be like, yes, I hear these often in my home, but I don't know what they mean. Okay, how many of you know what all 6 of these terms mean? Anyone brave enough to say, I know all 6 of them? Who doesn't know what any of them mean? Anyone in that category? All right, great. I'm going to translate these for you if you promise me not to go home and use them, all right? Because that is incredibly uncool. But it is good to just know what your kids are saying when they use these phrases, but also increasingly those on your team. So here's what these phrases or terms mean from a Gen Z standpoint. Now, in case you're not sure, that one at the bottom means chuggy, or the way you say that or pronounce it is chuggy. So chuggy is the opposite of being cool. So if you ever find yourself wanting to ask a question, how would I know if I was chuggy? If you have to ask the question, you probably are, okay? In fact, pretty much anyone over the age of 30 or 35 is chuggy in the eyes of Gen Z automatically. We are also seeing with this group, the way they use emojis is changing. So up on the screen are some of the common emojis you'll tend to see Gen Z using. Here's the trick. When this group use these emojis, they mean a very different thing from what all of us oldies mean when we use these emojis. So for instance, like when I use, like the 1 second from the top there is one of my default emojis for if you've got a cold or allergies or hay fever or whatever. The 1 second from the bottom, that used to be one of my smiling emojis until I discovered what this means when Gen Z use it. And it wasn't what I thought. Okay, so if you've got Gen Zs that you're managing or leading in your teams, but also if you've got them at home, this is your cue to grab out your phone to take a photo of the next slide, because I'm going to translate these emojis for you so you know what Gen Z mean when they use them. Okay, so here's what these translated emojis mean. Now, I don't know why that 1 second from the bottom means extreme passive aggression, but you better know that, okay? Or you could misuse it incredibly easily. Now, the other thing I'd encourage you with is never, ever, in a professional context, ever use the cupcake emoji, all right? It is not going to go well for you, all right? And so we're seeing how just different generational approaches to this stuff is. So that's the first key. If we're going to gear up well for the future, The first priority or paradigm is we've got to be thinking tides and not waves, and some of those tides be AI or generational change. These are things that will define the next couple of years. Number 2, second mindset or priority that's going to matter is this. We need to be thinking curiosity, not certainty. And this is tricky because I get it. We are in an age where things are changing so quickly. There is such turbulence. There's an instinctive reaction for a lot of us to want to cling to things that we know to be true, to cling to certainty. And I get that, and yet that's such an incredibly dangerous thing to do as well. I mean, when we become more interested in having answers than asking questions. Because the old saying is so true, the moment you think you've made it, you've passed it. The moment you stop asking questions, the moment you slip out of that posture of student, wanting to become the expert, have all the answers, that's when things get dicey. And the truth is, curiosity is so vital for any organisation or leader wanting to be future-proof. In fact, one of the researchers who's done the best work looking at this is a guy named Philip Tetlock. So Philip Tetlock's a lecturer at Wharton School over in the US at the University of Pennsylvania. He has spent 20 years looking at what is it that separates leaders who gear up well for the future and for change as opposed to those who get caught off guard by the future and often get wiped out by it. And in the book he wrote is the consolidation of a lot of that research. I would encourage you to get a hold of, called Super Forecasting. And it's a brilliant book looking at this very theme. One of the quotes from this book, which I thought sort of summarised the thesis of the book best, was this quote here from Tetlock when he said, the essential factor in being future fit is not intelligence, it's curiosity. Staying again in that posture of being curious rather than being certain. And so there's value in us always trying to sort of humble ourselves, adopt a posture of intellectual humility, open to, curious about, have that sense of wonder that often we see in children. How do we maintain that as adults, even as we become expert and experienced? But I also suggest that there's a lot of value in leveraging the perspective of those in your teams who are naturally curious, particularly those who are curious simply because they've got fresh eyes. They're new. They're new to the organisation or new to the role. And the beauty of people with fresh eyes is they don't know how stuff's always been done. They'll have no trouble thinking outside the box because they don't even know what the box looks like at this point. That's one of the beautiful things people with fresh eyes bring, is that level of enthusiasm and curiosity. In fact, speaking of thinking outside the box, I love the students' exam response as a case in point of just seeing things that all the experts had missed. And school teachers will tell you this is not called fresh eyes, it's called smart ass, okay? But it does make the point. And the beauty of people with fresh eyes, their inherent curiosity, is there are 2 questions they will ask most readily. They'll come into your teams and they'll ask questions like, why do we do it that way? Or why do we do this at all? Those are such powerful questions. And I reckon the best example I've come across over the years of seeing this very dynamic in action was when I was speaking at a conference back in Brisbane in Australia for a group of local government leaders. These are all leaders of local councils. One of the guys I was chatting to during the lunch break was the head of asset management for one of the big councils in Queensland. I won't name the council, but it's a big one. And he said they'd had this very experience in the previous 12 months of someone coming straight out of university into a role at the council in the asset management department with fresh eyes. And this young guy turned up, and the first thing he noticed as he looked through the asset registry, which is the database of all the stuff they use in council facilities, he realised there were a whole lot of assets they were paying monthly rental costs on, and had been doing so for years. In fact, this young guy came in and he went through the database of stuff they're using in council facilities and found there were a whole series of these box trailers. The average box trailer, get this, they had been renting for in excess of 13 years, paying monthly rental costs on. They'd spent on average 24 grand per trailer renting these things. These trailers cost about $7,000 to buy outright. It's like, what's the go? Why are we renting things we know we're going to need for a really long time? So we started to dig a little bit further. And he found there was a whole fleet of pedestal fans they were using in council facilities. The average pedestal fan, they'd spend almost $5,000 renting. They cost a few $100s to buy from the hardware store. So he goes to his boss, the guy I was chatting to at this conference, and said, why are we renting these things we know we're going to need for a really long time? And the guy I was chatting to said, at first I was a bit put out by the question. I'm like, this young punk, he's only been around for 6 minutes, and he's already asking why we do stuff the way we do. And he said, once I got over that sense of being offended by the question, he said, I realised it was a really good question. I don't know why we rent stuff. When I came to this council from another council to take over the role here, that's the way they did it here. And we'd improved the system over the years, but we basically kept it intact. So he said, we decided to engage in some innovation. Now, if you know much about how local government works, innovation doesn't tend to come naturally in the local government context. So he said, we put together a steering reference group and 2 separate committees to discuss all the related issues. After 7 months of deliberations, they decided to innovate, and they went from a rental model to a buy and depreciate model. And we were standing in a fairly sort of busy foyer area, much like the one out here as we were chatting, and he was leaning in, almost whispering at this point. He said, I'm actually embarrassed to tell you how much money we are saving ratepayers. It is a fortune. He said, I can't believe we didn't see it. It's so obvious now as we look back in hindsight, but he said it took someone from outside the echo chamber with fresh eyes to look at what we were doing, who was just inherently curious and start asking, like, why? And I applaud the fact that this leader was willing to at least step back once he got over that sense of being offended and be open to the question. The reality is I see time and time again the opposite response. People who, when they're challenged by a new perspective or just even the question of why, get defensive. And the interesting thing is in the last probably 3 or 4 years for my research is focused on the psychology of stubbornness. Why don't smart people change? Even when they want to, even when they know they should, even when they know the benefits of change, why do we dig our heels in instinctively? How many of you deal with stubborn people most days of the week? Hands up if you do, okay? Most of us do, and the truth is, I wonder how many, if I ask how many of you are the stubborn person, I wonder how many of you would raise your hands, and most of us can be from time to time. And even when you find yourself digging your heels in, even when you can have that internal dialogue, I don't know why I'm resisting this, but I just am. If you look at neurologically what's happening in our brains when we get stubborn, it's interesting because what the research in the last 10 years has revealed, and this goes to something that I think it was Jacob shared before, is that human beings aren't actually afraid of change. We've heard that so many times over the years, you just assume it's true. It's not. Humans are not afraid of change. You know what we are afraid of? You know what stops us from being willing to adapt and change? It's the fear of loss. The moment we feel like we're going to lose something in the process of changing, that's when we dig our heels in, even if, again, we know we probably should change. Now, as you're dealing with particularly volunteers, and many of you are leading a whole pile of volunteers in your roles, those who can often be the most stubborn because they're passionate. They know how things should be done because it's been done that way for years. If you look at what's behind that, what are the fears of loss that tend to drive stubbornness? And there are 3 that come to the fore. The first one is this, a loss of familiarity. Even if the way it was done in the past sucked, at least I knew it. I understand how the system worked. You want to ask me to do something different that's unfamiliar? Even if deep down I know it's a good idea, I'll dig my heels in because I like what is familiar. The second is the loss of power. I used to have status. I used to have power. And that might be eroded if we change. And the last one, and it's a related theme, is the loss of dignity. The loss of that sense of ego. And the moment ego gets involved, it's amazing how quickly people will get stubborn, even to their own detriment. And so the question is, how do we make sure we don't fall into this trap, particularly as leaders? And I love this quote here from one of the OG futurists. Alvin Toffler put it best when he said this, and I thought it was such a profound insight. He said, the illiterate of the future will not be those who can't read or write. It'll be those who can't learn, unlearn, and then relearn. And that's where curiosity comes in. You know some stuff, you've got some experience, and that's wonderful. Let that guide you, but not become a shackle as times and needs evolve and change. All right, the third key is if the first key in getting ready for the future is to think tides, not waves. The second is to think curiosity, not certainty. The third key is this, how do we think progress and not precedent? How do we be more loyal to the future than the past? And again, this is a challenge when you've often got a lot of tradition to build on. Sacred cows in the organisation, the way we've always done things that people want to cling to. I'm guessing many of you will be well familiar with this quote. It's often attributed to Einstein, even though there's a bit of conjecture as to whether he said this or something similar to this. The quote is that Einstein said the insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get a different result. Many of us know this quote. It's almost a cliche. But here's the thing. Can I suggest if Einstein was defining insanity today, in June of 2024, based on just how quickly things are changing and moving around us, I have a hunch he would define insanity today the opposite way to what we see on the screens here. I reckon he'd say that today, actually, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get the same result. Now, follow me here. What I mean by this is, if you're using the same techniques, the same approaches, the same back-end systems you were using 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, expecting them to be as effective in the future as they were in the past, you're going to be sorely mistaken. I mean, the pace of change means we can never stand still for long. The reality is best practice doesn't stay best practice for long. And so the challenge is, how do we not fall into that trap? And we often see this of people just doing the same thing over and over again because it's comfortable and secure and all the rest of it. And just to look at how endemic this can be, I want to play another quick game with you. You may remember this game from when you were a kid at school. Remember rock, paper, scissors, or scissors, paper, rock? We're going to have a quick game of rock, paper, scissors here this morning. It'll be the best of 3 rounds. The first thing you need to do is figure out, just by looking around at your tables, who you reckon you're going to be most likely to beat in a game of rock, paper, scissors. And pair up with that person. Okay, it'll be the best of 3 rounds. Okay, so pair up, fists out in front of you, ready for round number 1. Are you ready? And 1, 2, 3. All right, round number 2. And 1, 2, 3. All right, here's the decider. Round 3. Ready? And 1, 2, 3. All right, very good. Okay, those of you who just won in your little pairs, you're going to be the talkers for the next few moments. Those of you who we won't say that you lost. We'll do what happens with Gen Zs in schools. You just came second, okay? So if you just came second, you're going to be the listeners, but listen very carefully because there is going to be a test, all right? So if you just won in your little pair, if you're the talker, here's what I'd like you to do. Turn to the person you just beat in that little game, and in 25 seconds, describe for them step by step in chronological order the process that you go through to get in your car and drive to the end of your street at home. Every step you go through to do that. 25 seconds, go for it. All right, 10 seconds to go. Five seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right. Now, if you were the listener just then, I hope you were listening very carefully because here's your test. All right. In a few moments, I'm going to put up a list on the screen here of 9 steps. Have a look through this list of 9 steps. Pop your hand up if your partner missed at least one of these steps in their description just then. Who missed one of them? Who missed all 9 of them? Anyone miss all 9? There's only a few in every crowd. Now, here's the reality. I'm guessing most of you do most of those 9 things every time you drive your car to the end of your street. Here's the problem. That is something you do so often, so unconsciously on autopilot. When I ask you to make it conscious or explicit to describe someone sitting next to you, it's actually really hard to do, isn't it? And it's exactly the same for us in our professional roles. We do the same things so often and for so long, we become oblivious to the stuff we're doing that is maybe not even relevant anymore, not even sensible anymore, not getting results that it once did. In fact, I love this quote here from a woman who's one of the head lecturers at Harvard in the business faculty. Rosbeth Moss-Cantor said, that sort of habitual thinking is the number 1 enemy of innovation. That's what stops us from adapting as times and needs changes. We just get so used to doing things the same way on autopilot, unthinkingly, unconsciously. And so how do we avoid that trap? And I've loved looking at this with some of my client work over the last little while. One of my favourite examples of how to address that as a trap in organisations, I learned when I was doing some work with Oricon. Now, Oricon, many of you would know them. They're a global design and engineering firm, big presence here in New Zealand. And a few years ago, Oricon got to the point where they were sort of losing their edge. And they were pitching for work and losing out to competitors. And the feedback from customers was, we really like you guys at Oricon, but you're just not creative enough. You're not innovative enough. You're a bit stuck in your ways. And so the new CEO that had come into the top job at Oricon, who'd previously been at Deloitte, said, look, we've got to change the culture and do it really fast. He said, something we tried in just one of the departments at Deloitte, we might want to try sort of more broadly here and see how it works. And so what they implemented was a thing called, and some of you may want to try this within your own teams, you'd be amazed what it leads to, was a thing called the Dumb Things We Do initiative. So they said to their staff, 3,500 staff globally, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think that we are doing as an organisation that's just a bit dumb, that isn't getting results that it used to, or is maybe just nonsensical, or maybe gets in the way of a good customer experience? You heard in one of the presentations this morning the word friction. What's causing friction for our customers? In some cases, it might be your parents who are trying to engage in sport. And so they said, okay, tell us, what are the dumb things we're doing? And the key is you could actually suggest these things anonymously. That's dangerous. Okay, so what was interesting is that the leadership team, they knew that there'd be a fair few things flood back in. They weren't ready for how many ideas would be suggested and the enthusiasm with which people would share them. So within a couple of days, they'd had hundreds of these ideas flood back in of dumb things the company was doing. You know what's interesting? The most significant and insightful of these suggestions came from frontline staff, those dealing with customers every day. It wasn't middle management, it certainly wasn't the executive suite, it was frontline staff. They know what's going on. They know where the points of friction and frustration are. They know the dumb things the company's doing. And it was interesting, for a few of the leaders on the leadership team, this was a confronting experience because some of the very things that had been suggested as dumb things were things those leaders had implemented 8 years earlier, 9 years earlier. They had to have the humility to realise maybe it's best practice then, but it's not now. And they took this list of hundreds of ideas that had been suggested, they condensed it down to a top 100 list of dumb things, and here's what they did next. They went to the organisation and they said, look, thank you for engaging in this process. Our commitment to you, in 100 days, we will fix or get rid of all 100 of these dumb things we're doing. And they did it in 100 days. And it radically changed the company. In fact, I was interviewing one of the exec team at Oricon who was part of the initiative at the time. John Maguire said this so thoroughly changed the culture, the ethos of the company. We talked about innovation for years, but until there was a specific mechanism for doing it, we just weren't having the conversations required. And to give you a sense of how big a deal how big a difference this made, they went from being very stodgy and stuck in their ways to being voted a few years later, 2.5 years later, as Australia's most innovative company. Now, for an engineering firm, that's extraordinary. This is beating the tech companies, the ad agencies. The most innovative company was an engineering firm, and a big part of this was this experience. And it was interesting chatting with John as I was interviewing him. One of the phrases he used was this notion of what this allowed them to do was prune away a whole lot of dead wood, stuff that had grown up around the organisation over years. But as we finished this thought, and I'm going to wrap up in a couple of moments, the interesting thing is, I remember speaking with someone a little while later who's an expert gardener. And we're talking about the whole theme of pruning and how important that is for organisations. There'll be some of you here that need to hear this morning because this is the challenge you're facing. And this expert gardener said, well, getting rid of dead wood actually isn't the real skill in pruning. Getting rid of dead wood's really easy. Because dead wood's obvious. It's dry, it's brittle, it's lifeless, it's brown. It costs nothing to get rid of dead wood. So the real skill in pruning is actually getting rid of stuff that is still green, still growing, still bearing fruit. But if you leave it there, it'll attract energy from where you need things to grow in the future. And for some of you, in order to future fit your organisations or future proof your organisations, it's going to mean pruning away stuff that, they're not dumb things. They're not even things that aren't working. They're things that are still working, but if you're not careful, it's like what Voltaire said, the good becomes the enemy of the best. And this is politically unpopular sometimes. You'll roll back programs, initiatives that represent where you have been rather than where you need to go. And that's hard. And it takes resolve. It takes wisdom, discernment to know what to cut away and what to leave. But that's the essential skill of a leader in the years ahead is, again, how do we think progress rather than precedent? I'm very mindful of the clock. We're going to wrap up in a couple of moments. I'll just put my details up on the screen. Feel free to check out the website. A whole pile of stuff that could be helpful up there. A whole lot of video posts and articles and blog posts and the rest. That QR code is for my LinkedIn profile. So if you spend much time on LinkedIn, feel free to connect there. Every morning at 8:45 Sydney time, so that'll be 10:45 your time in the morning, I'll do an update. And that update every day is whatever I've seen come through overnight. So any new technology announcements, any new data that has come to light, because this stuff is moving very fast right now. So feel free to connect on LinkedIn. It'll probably ask you to either follow or connect, whatever it does, just do that. Okay, and you'll see each morning, again, 10:45 your time, you'll see that update pop up just in my feed of just whatever I've seen come through overnight. So hopefully that's helpful just to stay on top of some of this stuff. The other thing, in case it would be useful, I had a book come out a couple of months ago looking at this sort of last 3 or 4 years of research around the psychology of stubbornness. Why don't people change? And how do you get through to people when they are stubborn, resistant, the position, that state I call being mind stuck? How do you do this well? Logistically, it was tricky to get books here for today. So what we've got actually is a couple of chapters for free up online, which you can just download. I'd encourage you to download this, share it with your teams. There's a QR code I'll put up shortly for the chapters that are up online. It's just on a website for the book. So feel free to have a look at that. Just to start this conversation within your teams, right? Those who are stubborn and resistant, how do we get through to them? What is it causes people to be stubborn, and then how do you get around that? So hopefully that, just even as a bit of a snapshot of some of the content, some of the research, will be a useful starting point. But as we do finish up, I wanted to leave you this morning with a quote. And what I love about this particular quote is, firstly, it's really old. In fact, it's 2,600 years old, which is pretty ancient in anyone's books, really. But I reckon it is more relevant today than ever, particularly as we confront this question of what's changing and how do we get ready for it. And it's a quote from the great Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who put it beautifully when he said this. He said, "Resisting change is a little bit like trying to hold your breath. Even if you are successful, it's not going to end well." Okay, and that'd be my simple encouragement to you. I get it. The pace of change is dizzying. It is overwhelming. There's sometimes this instinct of wanting to just check out. It's all too much. Or even just to push back, to fight against the change. All we can really do is gear up. and adapt in the face of this stuff. So again, thanks so much for having me. I hope that was helpful. Enjoy the rest of the event. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Michael. We do have a little bit of time for questions, so if you want to ask any questions, either just chuck your hand up or throw something in the app. But I do have a question here, Michael. How would you reconcile curiosity and innovation with well-being and stress? Is this a necessary impact we need to manage?
Yeah, which is, like, it ties into one of the themes you often hear, which is people talk about change fatigue. Like, we're all just overwhelmed by change. We need to do more change, and I get that. But often the greatest cause of stress is when people feel like they're being asked to change, but they're not feeling supported in doing so. So creating that sense of psychological safety is essential, because for your teams to be willing to adapt and change, firstly, they need to feel like you've got their back, because things will go wrong. There'll be stuff-ups, there'll be failures, stuff will fall over. And so making sure that it's absolutely clear in people's minds that the process of changing is a messy one, acknowledging that up front. The other thing is, if you're going to try and get people to change, rather than trying to upsell the benefits of change, you're smarter to lessen the loss. Address some of those losses we talked about. And so, for instance, one of the key things you can do is show how change is an extension of the past rather than a break from it. So things are going to change, but at least frame it in a sense that are using the same terms, the same language, the same structure that people are familiar with. Because when you have leaders come into an organisation and they just tip the box upside down, like, let's just do everything new, people's instinctive response is, this is completely foreign and stressful, and I'm going to resist the whole thing, even if deep down I know we needed to change. And so even to try and keep language the same can make a huge difference, because it gives people that sense of, okay, even though there's a lot that's different, there's some things that are familiar. I feel safe enough to be willing to change by degrees. So I think these are things that leaders can do just to give people that sense of safety and security, that changing is not an entirely overwhelming process. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, brilliant. Anybody else got a question? Please don't make me run. I can walk briskly. Anyone? Very quickly. No, I think
sound like an auctioneer. Going once, going twice.
I think because you covered so much and it was such a brilliant talk, I do want to wrap things up. I've written some notes down here. 3 things that you talked about. Think tide, not waves. Think curiosity, not certainty. Think progress, not precedent. So I kind of put that together and went, don't be afraid of the tides. Embrace curiosity and acknowledge the past, but be prepared for the future. Michael, thank you so much for an absolutely brilliant presentation.
So
Fun, informative, entertaining, relevant, and it is little wonder that you are a revered speaker on the speaking circuit. And thank you so much for your time and energy and insight this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael McQueen. So that's us for this part. We are going to take a 15-minute break before we come back in here ready to go again at 11 a.m, well 20 minutes actually. And just for those who are taking the bus transfer, because our program has changed, that has been brought forward to 3:30, so you don't have to worry about that. So we'll take a break and see you back in here in around about 20 minutes time. Kia ora tātou.